Hello, noble ones. Welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. And today we're going to talk about the gladiator classes again. This is going to be the last video about this specific topic. Now, by this I don't mean that I'm not going to talk about gladiators again. I will, but not about equipment and specific classes or types of gladiators. I noticed that you liked the first video that was about the most commonly known gladiator classes. I noticed that you liked the second video about the less commonly known gladiator classes. But for this video, I have gathered some gladiator classes that probably you have never heard about. So without further ado, let's get to it. Now, before I begin, please keep in mind that in the other two videos I've always showed a picture of what I was talking about, that it was a representation of the kind of gladiator that I was describing. But for these gladiator classes, these are so obscure that it was basically impossible to find representations. All we have is just written examples for most of the cases. So the images that you will see, I have chosen them just to give you an idea of what I am talking about. The first one is the catervarius. Now, the name catervarius comes from the word caterva, which is a Latin word, which we still have in Italian, which means a huge and chaotic mass of crowd of men. Okay. Now, what happened is that several catervari, so quite a few of these gladiators, would go into the arena to fight in basically a huge battle. Was very loud, obviously, and it was basically everyone was against everyone. It was like a all against all, pretty much. So you must have imagined the complete mess that was. Now, the idea is that probably some of these catervari must have managed to kind of create a little group and actually have victory. And that was one of the in some cases some of these people could actually become one of the classes that I've talked about before, because someone would notice them. Postulaticus. This is an incredibly interesting kind of gladiator. And now this took its name from the word postulare, which means to ask in Latin. Now, this kind of gladiator had this name because it was the arena and the great request of the public that would have the emperor pay a lanista, which is basically the owner and trainer of gladiators, in order to have back a gladiator that would be considered as postulaticus, who was basically either a champion or a very popular gladiator that wasn't supposed to fight on that day, or that maybe had retired. Now, these were quite expensive performances, so the emperor was paying well the lanista for these. So it was the lanista's job to make sure that the performance of this postulaticus would be worth the price, if you know what I mean. Normally there was at least one postulaticus, and we know that there was always at least one postulaticus in the matches, or at least important matches, and the presence of a postulaticus was advertised to the people through actual posters, like similar to flyers, for example. Normally what they did is that before the actual match they would purposely make the postulaticus late. He would actually be late because they wanted the whole congregation to actually start asking for for this specific gladiator to enter the arena, and then he would. Now, I want you to imagine what this situation must have been like. Imagine that, let's say that your name is Mike, and you're there. You know you've been waited. You know people want you to fight there, but you're still waiting, and you start hearing all these thousands of voices screaming your name, like, Mike, Mike, Mike. Imagine the adrenaline when you enter, and you see that all those people are waiting for you to fight. I mean, that must have been an incredible experience. Nobilus. Nobilus obviously means nobles, so members of aristocracy. Some of these did become gladiators, although it may seem unfathomable for us now to consider, but we need to consider that from a historical point of view, some nobiles, some aristocrats in Roman times, were poor. Some were extremely rich, but others had debts, for example. And when you had a lot of debts and you needed to pay these debts, some of these people actually decided to try and fight as gladiators. This was something that some members of the Senate would consider rather preposterous, and particularly when it was the emperor who would just select some random nobles and put them in forcefully in the arena. That would be it didn't happen a lot, but occasionally it did. But it was, of course, a way also to gain fame and glory, and riches if they did manage to fight well. But these kind of matches were very well appreciated by people who were running these gladiator matches and the arena and everything, because they would immediately be an amazing event, and lots of people would go to the Colosseum, for example, or to these arenas to actually see and watch these noblemen fight, sometimes die and sometimes be wounded and other times win. Imagine if one of our modern politicians, for example, filled with debts, would just become an MMA fighter and start fighting to death. I think a lot of people would start watching that. That's for sure.
My mother would cry in the TV when
Now the next couple of gladiators are quite interesting, so let's have a look. The first I'd like to talk about is the caesarianus. Now, for those of you who have an overall understanding of Latin, you will have immediately spotted the similarity with the Latin word or name, Caesar. Now, Caesar is basically the emperor, like Caesar, basically. Although please note that the pronunciation that I'm using now is classical Latin. If you wish to use, or you're more used or familiar with ecclesiastical Latin, then these would be pronounced Caesarianus and Caesar, sorry. But in this case I'm using Caesar and Caesarianus because those would be the actual classical pronunciation. So these were gladiators that basically belonged to the emperor, and they were directly trained at the barracks or training center in Capua, or Cesariana di Capua, which is a very small town in the Campania region, which is the same region where Naples is, for those of you who are not from Italy, and it's not far away from the city of Caserta. Now, another kind of gladiator that is kind of similar is the aulicus. Now the aulicus comes from the Latin word aula. Now aula basically means the imperial court. So also this gladiator was linked to the emperor, but for a different reason, not because the training center, but because it belonged to one of the imperial troops. What I mean by that is when we consider legionaries and centurions, for example, going to war, we always have this idea of the loot that they could have, which most of the times we think either money, for example, or for example animals and things, but sometimes some of these gladiators would gain slaves. And when you had a fit slave, some war veterans would turn these slaves into gladiators in order for them to get, so the owners to get fame and money and treasures from this, and for these gladiators an opportunity to become from a slave to actually turn into a free man. Although of course that wasn't very high in the list of, for as far as the probability are concerned. The andabata. Now the andabata is mentioned by Marcus Tullius Cicero, who is, as you know, a famous philosopher, politician and writer, Roman writer. Now please note again that I am using classical pronunciation for his name, because in ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin, his name will be pronounced Cicero, not Cicero, just to make sure we understand who we are talking about. Now, we are not quite sure whether it was an actual gladiator kind or if it was something that occasionally happened, but what we're talking about when we say andabata, we're talking about a gladiator who fought with his eyes covered with probably some kind of bandages, so completely blind. These kind of gladiators were using only their hearing to actual battle, and probably were fighting against other people like them, so andabata against andabata. So they would also hear how the crowd and everyone, the spectators, were reacting to certain moves to try to understand what was going on. There are two curious things about these gladiators. Well, first of all, obviously these kind of fights must have been a total mess. So, and that's probably why the people were enjoying these, watching these kind of alternative matches, because they must have been quite funny to watch for the perspective of ancient Romans. Another thing is that, interesting to this, is the fact that the name is not originally Latin, but it's originally coming from ancient Greek, and it actually means to ride some kind of mount. So this also makes us think that perhaps was some kind of early kind of jousting, perhaps, which was done in the arena, but we do not have much historical evidence. It is just historical speculation, but it would be an interesting thought to think about. Meridianus. Now, Meridianos is an interesting kind of gladiator. It helps us understand how the whole Colosseum and the whole battle in the arena and the whole gladiator fights were organized. Now, the name Meridianos comes from the word meridianos, which means midday, and that was precisely when these gladiators, the meridiani, would enter the arena to battle. Now, the reason why it was chosen to have these people enter that specific time is because it was when we had a lunch break, basically. So some of the spectators would go out to get lunch, others would just eat there or maybe come back, and in the meantime you could have these meridiani just do little battles for those who actually remained. And normally the meridiani would be those gladiators that weren't particularly good at fighting, or perhaps that were starting to get quite old, but it was still an occasion to perhaps have someone notice you and promote you to a higher rank. Rudiarius. Now, rudiarius is not really a class of gladiator, but I've decided to put it in this video because I think it's an interesting piece of historical information. Now, what a rudiarius is, it comes from the word rudis, which is a wooden gladius, a wooden sword. This sword was given to this gladiator at the end of his career, basically, which could happen after 16 victories. Now, what did happen is that basically often gladiators who would become rudiarius would come back to the arena. The reason for that, either money or fame, or perhaps because they liked that kind of life. Some did. Not all are to be considered as slaves. We have different situations with different gladiators. Something similar also happened with some legionaries. Some legionaries, even after they leave, they would decide to go back to the army to continue fight. Tertiarius. The name tertiarius comes from the Latin word tres, which means three, and basically the rules, the regulations of the arena forced these kind of early gladiators to actually take the place of gladiators who had lost, for example, 3 times, or who were wounded 3 times in one day. So it's very similar to the modern concept of football, and football players who actually go out and you basically substitute them with a fresh one to continue the fight with the winner, with the actual winner. Obviously, these could be any kinds of gladiators, any classes. There isn't just one class that is the tertiarius. It's just a specific role that I've decided to put in this list just for interest. And it was the lanista, so the owner, who was deciding who could be a tertiarius and who could be an actual frontline full gladiator. He was also a way to avoid having wounded gladiators who actually die, which wasn't something as common as many people think, but I will make a specific video about this. Alright then, I hope that you enjoyed this video like you did for the others. If you did, please thumb up, and if you haven't, subscribe to my channel. I am also going to make many other videos about gladiators, about ancient Rome, but also about Middle Ages and obviously weapons and armor. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings.